Today we talk about the movement called ordinary language philosophy. Ordinary language philosophy I cover as part of the history of analytic philosophy because it occurs in the same time frame and in the same geographic region and involves some of the key players from the movement known as analytic philosophy. It's not clear to me that ordinary language philosophy counts as a kind of analytic philosophy, but in any case, it plays a central role in the history that takes us up to about 1970. Ordinary language philosophy starts with Wittgenstein returning to Cambridge in the late 1920s. By the time we get to the 1930s, Wittgenstein has abandoned the views that he was defending in the Tractatus. Our record of what was going on in the 1930s is contained in the Blue and Brown books, but the Blue book is a set of lectures dictated to students in 1933 and 34, but it wasn't published until 1958. So basically, we have no writings of Wittgenstein of any substantial amount from his time at Cambridge, and nothing really much got published or made accessible until after his death. Nonetheless, he was enormously important philosophically at this time. So what he tells us, what we learn when we look at the Blue and Brown books especially, is that he has, in his own words, abandoned his contempt for the particular case and focuses more on specific cases leading to what comes to be called a family resemblance approach to meaning. He rejects a picture theory of meaning in favor of a use theory. So what do these remarks tell us? We're going to get to his skepticism about meaning in a moment, but what this early part seems to suggest is, if you recall, the Tractatus contains a kind of transcendental deduction that there have to be atomic facts. The world is all that is the case, and it is constructed out of the atoms, the logical atoms. Even so, we don't get any example of what these atoms are supposed to be or what they're supposed to look like. Perhaps that's what Wittgenstein means when he had a contempt for the particular case. He was interested in the generalities, but not the particular details. Unlike Russell, if you recall, Russell has a sense datum theory about what the logical atoms are that underlies his version of logical atomism. But Wittgenstein has no such thing. So now, instead of a contempt for the particular case, we have a more decided focus on specific cases. He also rejects the general picture theory of meaning, insisting that meaning is somehow tied to how words, phrases, sentences, and maybe even whole theories are used. A use theory of meaning, by the way, needs to be approached cautiously. There's something that must be right about meaning having something to do with how words are used, but there can't be any straightforward identification of the two, because people misuse words and misuse language all of the time. So even though there's some sense in which perhaps meaning and use are tied, no simple use theory of meaning has any hope of being adequate. Wittgenstein also comes to express a kind of skepticism. He thinks the meaning of a term is somehow connected with following a rule, but following a rule involves firstly interpreting it and applying this interpretation to a case at hand. The worry here is about the possibility of ostensive definitions to ground the picture theory of meaning, since there's a kind of rigidity of assignment that's presupposed in such a definition, so that the future uses of the term have to conform to the original baptism. So think about naming you get a puppy and you're going to name your puppy. So suppose you're going to name your puppy Fido. All future uses of the word Fido have to honor this original baptism moment when you said, I'm going to call my dog Fido. But Wittgenstein worries here that there's no way other than watching to see how the future unfolds to determine what rule is being applied. There is, that is, no way for there to be a fact of the matter about the rule following. And if that's true, then you're going to have to be skeptical about the meaning of the term Fido. What is the semantic content of that term? It looked like it was supposed to be a term whose semantic value is the dog, the little puppy who grows into a dog. But if there's some way in which your use of the term has to answer to future uses, Wittgenstein worries that maybe there's no fact of the matter about how you're going to use the term in the future, and hence no fact of the matter about what this word refers to. For example, maybe, given what you just said and did in naming this little puppy, maybe by the time the puppy gets to be a year old, it's no longer a puppy, and so Fido only named the puppy, but not the dog that results after the puppy grows up. So maybe there are grounds for some concern about what the meaning of the term really is, even in the most explicit cases of naming. Central to late Wittgenstein is something that he calls the private language argument. The private language argument is super important in the history of ordinary language philosophy, and it's supposed to somehow establish that the picture theory of meaning can't be right, and that somehow or other private languages are impossible, but that they need to be possible for the Tractatus picture theory of meaning to work. So let's talk a little bit about how that's supposed to go. Simple objects in the Tractatus were not characterized by Wittgenstein. He told us there had to be simple objects, but he didn't say anything about it, just like there had to be atomic facts, but he didn't give us an example. They might be material objects, they might be sense data. Wittgenstein had no dog in this fight, since the requirement of simple objects was a kind of transcendental deduction without any particular cases doing any work in the story. The interest of the Vienna Circle was in the epistemology of science, and it involved a clear identification of simples with the basic experience that underlies scientific confirmation. The simple objects of the Tractatus then they thought had to be, the initial thought was they had to be sense data. That was what the Vienna Circle took the Tractatus to be claiming. The basic worry is that a purely phenomenal language, Wittgenstein thought, would be unteachable. So that's the idea. If all of your language refers at bottom to sense data, you couldn't teach the language to anybody else. That would be bad enough. Private here means, for Wittgenstein, unteachable. So Wittgenstein does what lots of philosophers do. They start demanding a criterion. You claim to know things. What is the criterion for you knowing? In any case, let's see what Wittgenstein does with this notion of a criterion. In the case of applying a term to a sensation, you can't know that you are using the term correctly, Wittgenstein worries, since you have no way of distinguishing the cases in which your use is correct from cases in which they are not, and without a criterion of correctness, there can't be any notion of meaning involved. I hope you hear that this talk about a criterion, I hope you hear it as a kind of slippery, sophistical worry that may or may not contain the germ of a good worry, but on the surface just looks like something that needs articulation and defense at a much more careful level. That's what I hope you hear. In any case, that's Wittgenstein's concern. I need a criterion for when you're applying the term correctly and when you're not. If you don't have a criterion, there can't be. If you can't tell me what the criterion is, there can't be any notion of meaning involved. Now, I hope your sense of this demand for a criterion reminds you of something that Moore told us about levels confusion. Moore said all sorts of things, but he said, look, there's some things that are perfectly clear and straightforward that you know about, but you may not know how you know about them. That's a harder question. Or, terms have a meaning, but what's unclear to us is what the analysis of that meaning is. We don't have to have an analysis of the meaning to know that a term has a meaning or what its meaning is. It looks like this demand for a criterion is just a repeat of these levels confusions. So if there's something here more than a levels confusion, something much more careful needs to be articulated and defended. In any case, once you get this demand for a criterion and this concern about the notion of meaning, Wittgenstein replaces it with a kind of linguistic behaviorism. Pain may seem to be a clear example of a sensation type which is independently recognizable, he says, but the word is really only a substitute for which the cry is a natural expression of the sensation. So once you see this sort of linguistic behaviorism, pinch yourself for a moment and ask yourself, does it hurt? Did I just experience pain? And then consider Wittgenstein's claim that the word pain doesn't refer to the sensation type, but it's really only a substitute for the cry, which is a natural expression of the sensation. This is something you see various versions of behaviorism doing as psychology is developed and as this demand for operational definitions takes hold on the intellectual communities in question. So what you can see Wittgenstein doing in the private language argument is saying the notion of meaning is a mysterious notion in some respects. It's not an observable entity. You can't tell just by using your senses what the words mean that come out of the mouth of a person. So we need to operationalize this notion of meaning and the relevant internal states of a person that the meaning of a term seems like it might be pointing to. That's the intellectual background of this kind of linguistic behaviorism that we see in late Wittgenstein. So this behaviorism fits nicely with the meaning as use approach. Since use is fundamental, it's also a kind of behavior, and whatever meaning is there to be found must be elicited from use across time and across subjects. So the privacy of the Tractatus view in the Vienna Circle is unsustainable, according to the later Wittgenstein. Finally, the later Wittgenstein is a philosophical quietist and anti-theory theorist, I want to say. He's anti-theory. All you're supposed to do, instead of telling people how things are supposed to go, you're supposed to describe what Wittgenstein calls the grammar of a form of life. And that is all there is to say about it. So, as we see ordinary language philosophy develop, you'll see things like P.F. Strawson's book, Individuals, which is described as a kind of, quote, descriptive metaphysics. All we're doing is describing what's there. When you ask the questions of realism and anti-realism, for example, think of a religious form of life. Pick your favorite, or least favorite, I don't care which one you pick, form of a particular religion. Is this religion true? What should a philosopher say about it? How do we talk, how do we write when we think about this particular form of life? Later, Wittgenstein says there's nothing to do beyond describing how the form of life works and how the language used within that form of life functions. So, is there really a God? That question is not one that the philosopher should be asking. You just say, well, in that religious community, it's assumed that there is a God. It's sort of a bedrock claim for that form of life. That's a descriptive project. It sounds a little bit like perhaps a kind of philosophical anthropology that's going on. There is nothing to do other than describe that. This is why late Wittgenstein is often thought of in terms of being a skeptic and a relativist. So, after Wittgenstein's death, a collection of his notes were published in a book called The Philosophical Investigations. Here's what we can detect in the Philosophical Investigations. First, some differences with the Tractatus view. There's a variety of functions of language rather than only one use, that of assertion, and the new view is about language games, as Wittgenstein calls them, and their relationship to forms of life. There are just lots of different ways of talking and thinking, and what's meaningful is dictated by the way the world is in the Tractatus, but in the Philosophical Investigations, it is the use of the language. There are method differences as well. The Tractatus, it was logical analysis that was doing all of the heavy lifting. In the Philosophical Investigations, it is detailed description of the way words are used, somehow discovering by this method when language was misused. That's an idea that is probably worth being a bit skeptical about. How do you discover misuses of language by properly characterizing how they are standardly used? It looks like the difference between proper use and misuse is going to be, at bottom, a kind of statistical fact rather than anything that could be discovered by philosophers sitting at their desk and thinking about it, trying to characterize how the word is used. Finally, here's Colin McGinn's quote about the investigations. Understanding, according to the investigations, is not an inner process of supplying an interpretation of a sign which justifies one in reacting with a sign in a certain way. It is rather an ability to engage in the practice or custom of using a sign over time in accordance with one's natural propensities. You should hear in this quote hints of a behaviorist account of meaning and use. The meaning of a sentence is how it's used, and how it's used is just a matter of linguistic behavioral practices. So what seemed to be an abstract and unobservable thing turns out to be characterizable in terms of linguistic behavior in some sense or other. The private language argument aimed at mental states determining meaning, is given up as well. It leads, he claims, to skepticism because no one else could know what you mean. Wittgenstein also says more. You couldn't understand your own language if meaning were private. Take the case of sensation S, for example, and assign a word to it ostensibly. For example, pain. You have a sensation and you decide to call it pain. I will call that pain. Wittgenstein says you need a distinction between appearance and reality for this ceremony to confer meaning. You need a criterion for correctness in establishing that this word means that sensation. Notice first the behaviorist leanings of this, but also I will tell you a little anecdote about the private language argument and what our attitude should be about how good or clear an argument it is. So a famous philosopher in the history of epistemology of the 20th century is Ed Gettier. Gettier wrote a really famous 2 or 3 page article arguing that knowledge is not justified true belief. Gettier began his career at Wayne State. And when he began his career, he was an ordinary language philosopher, a real fan of the late Wittgenstein, and fully convinced that the private language argument was deadly against its target. He was hired at Wayne State by Hector Neri Castaneda. Excuse my poor writing there. Anyway, Hector is from the South American country of Colombia, had a heavy Spanish accent, but Hector was not a fan of late Wittgenstein. They had a dispute one time in which Gettier said appealed to the private language argument to try to undermine something Hector was saying. And Hector's reply was, well, tell me what this argument is. I've never been able to figure it out. So Gettier showed him an argument, and Hector said, got a false premise. Gettier would go home, come back with a new version of the argument. This went on several times. And the end result was Gettier finally abandoned the private language argument, deciding there wasn't any decent formulation of this argument that Hector didn't have good objections to. If you want to see how that discussion went, you can look at, there's an old Edwards Encyclopedia of Philosophy that has an entry in it. I don't think it's online. I think you have to go look at it, at least last time I checked. You had to look at the print version of the Edwards Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It has an entry on the private language argument written by Hector Neri Castaneda. And it simply goes through a whole bunch of ways of trying to reconstruct this argument. And the article chronicles the conversations between Gettier and Castaneda about how the private language argument was supposed to go. And in the Edwards article on the private language argument, the result of this is skepticism about there being any such version of the argument that should persuade anyone. So if you're interested in the argument and want to pursue its details, you might take a look at Castaneda's article on it. In any case, I think a quicker way to see things that you might not like about the argument is just to recognize the behaviorist leanings in all of this. So if you've already become convinced that behaviorism isn't an adequate theory in psychology, it's not an adequate understanding of human behavior or any kind of animal behavior, you're not going to be that impressed with the behaviorist leanings of the late Wittgenstein. In any case, after the late Wittgenstein, there were lots and lots of ordinary language philosophy being done, and I've asked you to read some of these pieces just to give you a sense of what it's like. So one of them is Strawson's response to Bertrand Russell. The Strawson piece is interesting in its own right, and Strawson is one of the central figures in ordinary language philosophy, most famous for his book on Kant called Individuals. In any case, one of the things he's doing in On Referring is resisting Russell's account of denoting expressions that we studied when we looked at On Denoting. It is perhaps the most famous response to Russell. Strawson proceeds by trying to be more sensitive to ordinary language than Russell would have been. Remember that there's this strong tendency in Frege and the early stages of analytic philosophy to distinguish between natural languages, which are a mess, and ideal languages. So they worked harder at saying how we would go about understanding and characterizing a language that was more ideal than natural language, and then a little bit of hand-waving about what to do. I mean, natural languages are a mess. There's vagueness, there's ambiguity, you got names, you got 44 different people having exactly the same name. All of that just makes a mess of language. So ordinary language, early theorists thought of as a mess. Ideal languages were better. But of course, if you've been influenced by the late Wittgenstein, you'll think this animosity toward natural language is overdone, overwrought. I mean, what you're supposed to be doing is just characterizing how ordinary language works. So what you find in Strawson is much more sensitivity to the way ordinary language works and less willingness to just dispose of ordinary language in favor of an ideal language. So first, Strawson engages in some of that. He begins by talking about the uniquely referring use of an expression. Strawson's term for the use of an expression to mention or refer to some object. some individual person or single object in the course of making a statement about that person or object. Nothing surprising about that characterization. Expressions used and the uses made of them is important to Strawson. It is the use, not the expression, that is uniquely referring. Today, we might talk about type and token statements. So there's a type of statement. You and I can both assert the same sentence, and in doing so, we have asserted the same type of sentence. The token sentences, the one asserted by you and asserted by me, are not the same. They're unique. Moreover, if I said the same sentence 3 different times in a row, it would be the same type of sentence, but 3 different tokens of it. So Strawson wants us to focus on uses of expressions rather than on the expressions themselves that are uniquely referring. Expressions, Strawson insists, don't refer at all. Uses involve reference by some person or other. This is going to sound a bit pedantic, but let's go with it. An expression can't be said to mention or refer to anything. Mentioning or referring is not something an expression does. It is something that someone can use an expression to do. Okay, so we get a little bit of attention to details here, saying to talk about reference or denotation as a purely semantic notion is goofy. Reference is something that people do, not something that sentences or terms do. Strawson then distinguishes between sentences, uses, and utterances. So the sentence is a linguistic thing. The use of it is a sentence token. He accuses Russell of overlooking this. He confused expressions with their use in a particular context. Strawson thinks that if you ignore the distinction, it can appear that it's the same thing, a sentence that is both meaningful and either true or false, and that's what he wants to deny. Strawson claims that meaning is found at the type level, truth and falsity at the token level. So look at Russell's sentence, the King of France, the present King of France is bald. It's meaningful, but according to Strawson, the payoff of all of this distinction drawing is that no token of it is either true or false. So we're getting, what's important about Strawson's paper is this attack on bivalence. Russell is a committed fan of bivalence, so he wants the present King of France is bald to come out false. He also wants the present King of France is not bald to come out false. And he gives an explanation as to why that's not a violation of the law of excluded middle. Strawson doesn't want the sentence to come out true or false. He wants it to come out as meaningful, but neither true nor false. How does he do that? Well, he appeals to this notion of semantic presupposition. Consider these claims. The King of France is bald. There is a King of France. Russell holds that one entails two. His theory of descriptions makes two one of the 3 conjuncts that is his analysis of one. Strawson claims no, one doesn't entail two, it just presupposes two. To say the King of France is wise is in some sense of imply that there is a King of France. But this is a very special and odd sense of imply. Implies in this sense is certainly not equivalent to entails or logically implies. The fulfillment of the conditions for a correct ascriptive use of an expression is a part of what is stated by such a use, but the fulfillment of the conditions for a correct referring use of an expression is never part of what is stated, though it is, in the relevant sense of implied by such a use. So the difference between entailment and presupposition. X entails Y means that if Y is false, X has to be false as well. X presupposes Y means that X can't have a truth value unless Y is true. That's what Strawson needs. Now, note as well that Strawson's view is one of the options that Frege considered when addressing what to say about denoting expressions. Remember, he said we might have truth value gaps as a result of it. But there are 2 things going on here. One is is the law of bivalence correct? And the second is, what is presupposition and how does it differ from entailment? Note that this particular account of presupposition is unduly theory-laden. It involves the very claim in dispute that bivalence has to be abandoned or can be retained. So there's a standard view of entailment that X presupposes Y if and only if X entails Y and something else. Something else is true. So presupposition differs from entailment in that it's stronger. There's an additional condition that has to be satisfied beyond the entailment one. Strawson needs something different in order to generate the conclusion that he aims at. The conclusion that he aims at is that there's some sentences, in virtue of this phenomenon of presupposition, that don't have a truth value. For that, you need a different account of presupposition, and you need to tell us what this account is. What is it for X to presuppose Y so that X doesn't entail Y in some special way, but it stands in some other relation to the speaker in question so that we can derive loss of bivalence from it. You don't get that claim for free. You have to give an independent account of presupposition that generates it. That's the weakness of Strawson's position, but maybe there are such accounts of presupposition that will do the work required. That's worth further investigation, but not investigation that occurs during the period of history that we're studying. So we're not going to go into that. You're welcome to pursue that on your own if you wish. Stalnaker, for example, is one of the most important theorists who talk about presupposition and its relationship to entailment. So it might be worth looking at Stalnaker's work on presupposition if you're interested. Besides Strawson, I asked you to read Ryle and J.L. Austin's A Plea for Excuses. So the Ryle paper I had you read was Systematically Misleading Expressions. The reason for reading it is it and the Austin papers are probably the two most famous pieces to come out of the ordinary language tradition. I'm going to use them in my remarks for negative purposes. So the negative purposes are to show that ordinary language philosophy, even though it was a fad, let's just put it that way. It was enormously popular, followed by a bunch of people. Its intellectual home was at Oxford, and Oxford, by the end of World War II, had surpassed Cambridge as the intellectual center for English-speaking philosophy. And it was an assumption of the people at the time that the way to do philosophy was to do ordinary language philosophy. We'll see that in particular when we get to J.L. Austin's paper. But Ryle's paper is on systematically misleading expressions, and I asked you to read it because I want you to see that what he's doing is fundamentally the same kind of thing that Russell was doing in On Denoting. He was trying to get at the logical form of sentences where the grammatical form of the sentence can mislead you. In addition to engaging in the same project that Russell is engaging in, we get some nastiness toward philosophers in general, that philosophers are relatively stupid and have made all sorts of fundamental stupid errors in trying to understand language, and that's how you got these crazy metaphysical systems, all the stuff that we object to about systematic philosophy. We being the ordinary language philosophers that Ryle has been hanging out with. So he first tells us there's a whole bunch of systematically misleading expressions because their grammatical form misleads you into making some really stupid philosophical mistakes. And then we get the let's dump on the philosophers a bit. Philosophical arguments have always been, if not entirely, consisted in attempts to thrash out what it means to say so and so. Now, just pause there for a moment. Go back and read Descartes. Go back and read Plato. Read Anselm. Read Kant. How much of what they're doing is thrashing out what it means to say so and so? This is a complete myth. Philosophy has very rarely been engaged in at the level of what it means to say so and so. But if you look at the work of Moore and Russell, you might think, well, maybe that's what they are up to. They are focused on ordinary meanings, or meaning in some philosophy of language sense of semantic meaning. Maybe that's what they are doing. In any case, this is a highly misleading characterization of philosophical arguments in general. After he makes this claim, he says, why must the philosopher even ask what an expression really means? If the expression is used intelligibly, then there's nothing there to explain. In fact, the philosopher must already know what it means if he is to analyze it. So here, Ryle is distinguishing between the meaning of a term and the analysis of it. We saw a similar distinction in Moore. We know what the meaning is, but the proper analysis of it is something that is elusive. So what are these systematically misleading sentences? They are quasi-ontological statements and negative existentials. Notice these are just the kinds of things, or at least one of them is the kind of thing that Russell talks about in On Denoting. He's worried about negative existentials and the Meinongian approach to how to make sense of them. So what do these have in common? They have a grammatical form of attributing existence to something, but they're not best understood in that way. So here's a trap, he says. People who utter statements such as Satan does not exist understand perfectly well what they're asserting. Yes, I'm sure they do. Typically, people try to understand what they're asserting before they assert it. But there's a trap that the grammatical form of the sentence seems to indicate. The trap is that the grammatical form seems to indicate the having or not of a specified status, existence. So we can find examples of this. Mr. Baldwin is a being, Mr. Pickwick is a non-entity, Mr. Baldwin is an actual object or entity, Mr. Pickwick is an unreal object or entity. But as negative existentials show, often there is no subject whose existential status is being affirmed or denied. That's what the Mr. Pickwick example is supposed to be. The worst offenders are philosophers who make being or reality the subject of their propositions, or who treat real as a predicate. So there's lots of insidious animosity toward philosophers that probably ought to be directed at particular philosophers, such as, for example, Meinong. Meinong is somebody who looks like he'd make a fair target for the criticisms here, but Russell, Frege, Moore, other people like that don't seem to be people who are doing anything of the sort, even though these people are talking about what's real and what's not real. Think of what's real versus ideal for Moore. In any case, there's a kind of nastiness that can be detected toward philosophers in general who don't agree with Ryle. That seems a bit overwrought, overdone. Ryle then offers us a diagnosis. He says no ordinary person would fall into this trap. It's just dumb philosophers that do. And I agree, there's lots of dumb philosophy. Only some unwary philosophers are victims of it. And the people who are especially vulnerable are people who abstract and generalize. Now here Russell is perhaps a target, but it's not clear how he'd be a target. Remember, he thinks of logic as the most abstract and general investigation of reality as such. So if anybody's abstracting and generalizing, Russell is. But Russell doesn't fall into this trap. He's not especially vulnerable to it. Such people want to know what different facts of the same type have in common. To do this, they must use the common grammatical form of the statements of these facts as handles with which to grasp the common logical form of the facts themselves. Capone is not a philosopher. Satan is not a reality. Those are his examples. And you can look at this and you can listen and ask yourself, how is Russell guilty of doing these sorts of things? Or maybe Russell isn't the target. Who is? Russell is trying to grasp the common logical form of the facts themselves, but he's not at all inclined to group these two sentences together. So the logical form of Capone is not a philosopher. For Russell would be, where P is the predicate, is a philosopher, and C is a constant referring to Capone. You just negate that. Satan is not a reality is a quantified sentence. There is no X such that X equals Satan. So Russell is not looking at these two sentences, grouping them together and giving a common logical form for them, and it looks like it would be silly to do so. You could try to treat them the same, but there's no particular reason why. Another example of the attempt to generalize based on grammatical form. Again, who are we talking about? Did Plato do this? Did Aristotle? Did Aquinas? Did Descartes? Who are the people who are doing this? In any case, look at these two sentences. Mr. Baldwin is a statesman. Pickwick is a fiction. Do those two have the same logical form? Well, they have the same grammatical form. They're a combination of simple subject and predicate, where the subject is a name and the predicate is a one-place predicate. Ryle belabors this. There's nothing in the world of which we can say, there is a fiction, as we can say of Dickens, there is a storyteller. Instead, we clarify the statement, Pickwick is a fiction, roughly as implying some subjective attributes has the attribute of being called Dickens and being the coiner of false propositions and pseudo-proper names. Okay, this is actually kind of laughable. We are clarifying the statement, Pickwick is a fiction, roughly as implying some subject of attributes has the attribute of being called Dickens. This is a use-mention problem that we saw in Russell as well. You got to put Dickens in quotes because you're not using the name, you're mentioning it. And being a coiner of false propositions and pseudo-proper names. Well, maybe it does imply that, but in any case, this is a strange thing to point out as an implication. Yeah, there is an author, Dickens, he talked about Pickwick. And Dickens apparently coined a whole bunch of false propositions and pseudo-proper names. Now that's an interesting term in its own right. Why is it a pseudo-proper name? Looks to me like it's just a proper name, Pickwick. Apparently, Ryle must think to be a proper name, it actually must refer. A second class of systematically misleading expressions, the first one was about fictional entities, is about universals, statements about universals. Once again, there's a misleading parallelism. Jones gave himself the prize, virtue is its own reward. But it's absurd to plug the expression allegedly referring to a universal into the subject position of the first sentence. Virtue gave himself the prize. Yeah, that is because nothing can give himself a prize unless it's a male doing the giving. So it's absurd not because, it looks like it's absurd, not because you put the subject into the other sentence, but because of something having to do with the nature of the predicate involved. Switch it, do it the other way. Jones is its own reward. First, I don't know why you're referring to Jones using its, but it makes no sense. Jones is its own reward. So the failure of substitutivity isn't traceable to anything about terms that seem to refer to universals. It's just that when you have various subject terms, certain kinds of predicates belong, are appropriate, make sense, and some don't. This, by the way, is the notion of a category mistake that became famous. Ordinary language philosophers love to point out a category mistake. So making virtue into a subject that refers to a universal is somehow to commit a category mistake, and the substitution argument is supposed to convince us of that. This appeal to category mistakes has fallen out of favor because nobody's quite clear. I mean, there's some things that are obviously false. Virtue didn't give himself a prize. But if it's a category mistake, I mean, it's so obviously false that virtue did not give himself a prize. Why do we need something more than that's so obviously false? No one needs to think about it. In the same way, Jones isn't his own reward. What is it to be a category mistake that goes beyond pointing out that these are just silly, obviously false claims? In any case, the notion of a category mistake traces to this paper, and it became enormously important and an overused criticism of lots of things that are said in philosophy. So, apart from that, we'd like to know, what does he think is wrong with universals? Maybe there's going to be something substantive that goes beyond just dumping on other philosophers. So here Ryle opines that all statements seemingly about universals, such as virtue is its own reward, can be clarified to show that they are not about universals. If the need for universals is eliminated, then general terms need not be taken to stand for them. Yes, this is a standard. There are realists and nominalists in the history of discussion about universals. Realists say there have to be universals because we talk about them. Nominalists have always said, no, we can translate away and say what the sentence is talking about without any reference to universals. So it looks like here Ryle is just endorsing nominalism. Then if you endorse that, questions about what kinds of things universals are turn out to be bogus. Yeah, because there wouldn't be any universals. Doubly misleading are Platonic and anti-Platonic assertions, which are quasi-ontological and quasi-Platonic statements. Equality is a real entity. All right, that just mixes the universals together with the quasi-ontological ones. In any case, Ryle does not commit himself to the elimination of universals in general, but only in some cases. As before, ordinary speakers know what they mean when using quasi-ontological statements, and often their statements are true. Now, what to notice here is Ryle sets a task for himself, which the completion of would be a substantive philosophical accomplishment. He doesn't actually carry it out. But if you could show that this could be eliminated, that you could somehow talk about virtue being its own reward with something else that didn't refer or apparently refer to virtues in the subject term, then you will have done something in defense of nominalism. As it stands, though, we're getting universals classified as systematically misleading expressions, and we're getting Ryle's opinion that they're systematically misleading because they make it look like they're universals when we all know there really aren't universals. We don't need them for any theoretical purposes. The last part is the part that needs to be carried out as a philosophical project, not merely announced. A third class of systematically misleading expressions is just the ones that Russell was talking about. And here, the thing to note is that what Ryle is doing is nothing more, nothing different than what Russell was doing. We have definite descriptions. The grammatical form of them, as Frege noticed, made them look like they refer to things, but sometimes they don't. So the statements are sometimes used non-referentially, and Ryle calls that the quasi-descriptive sense of them. Then Ryle says there are many ways in which quasi-descriptions are misleading. One of these is when we talk about the meaning of an expression. It is not intended that there be a meaning in the way that there is a person about whom it is asserted our village policeman is fond of football. So there is no need, he says, to look for concepts to serve as the meanings of expressions. Now that's a particularly Fregean way of thinking about concepts, isn't it? So are there such things as meanings? Well, take a look at what he says about Tommy Jones is not the King of England. Poincaré is not the King of France. What is the King of France if it's not used referentially? But there isn't one, so definite descriptions are systematically misleading. Yes, we learned that from Russell, let's suppose. So what is the semantic value of a definite description? We have a proposal from Russell and a counter-proposal from Strawson, but in any case, think about Russell's. What is the meaning of the expression? What we're told is what it isn't. Oh, it's not. There isn't such a thing as the meaning of that phrase. Well, there need not be any such thing as the referent. So he says, since there isn't any such thing as the meaning, we don't need to posit semantic items to serve as the meanings. And if we refuse to do that, we won't have to ask, as Frege did, are they subjective or objective or not about anything? So he's, I think, aiming at Frege here. So the question is, if there aren't meanings, and you use the phrase, the meaning of X, you should really tell us what your non-Russellian account of definite descriptions is, because we know what Russell says. There is a thing that is a meaning of the expression X. It exists, blah, blah, blah. So what we get from Ryle is there isn't any such thing that is the meaning of the expression. So what is this phrase used for? How is it to be understood? We're told, nope, not going to tell you that. I'm just going to tell you where we didn't need to go. And so we didn't need to follow Frege. Why? Because we can intelligibly discourse about meanings in the following way. The meaning of X is Y can be clarified as X means what Y means. And so now notice, we don't have a referential expression in the second case, and the talk about meaning gets put into the verb. So essentially what Ryle is trying to do is take away the referential force of a definite description in the same way that Russell did. Put it into predicative position where all that's left is something that has no referential terms in it at all. For Russell, it was you had quantifiers, you had variables, and you had predicates. That was it. Ryle is trying to do something similar. X means what Y means. And then you don't need to talk about the meaning of X or the meaning of Y. You can just talk about what X means. What all of these cases have in common is that they fly in the face of Occam's razor, where you end up positing things that you didn't really need to posit. So you end up positing, if you're Meinong, non-existent beings. You end up positing universals, if you're Plato. You end up positing meanings, if you're Frege. In each case, entities are multiplied needlessly. Thus, Occam's injunction not to multiply entities without necessity can be understood in terms of grammatical forms. Don't treat all expressions which are grammatically like proper names or referentially used the phrases as if they were therefore proper names or referentially used the phrases. Now, if that were the final summary of your paper, it would look like this has already been done by Russell in On Denoting. So what's new here? Well, the insipid animosity toward philosophical projects and the like. So here's a further outline, which I will let you inspect on your own, rather than go through it, because that would be to go through the same paper twice. There is something worth noting. Right at the end, this is the biting character about philosophers. But this interest in the best way of exhibiting the logical form of facts is not for every man, but only for the philosopher. Why? Because only the philosopher gets bewitched by language. So, one last thought on Ryle's paper. Note the continuity and discontinuity with the program of analysis taken up by Russell in On Denoting. For both, bad metaphysical conclusions can be resisted by careful restatement of what is being said. For Russell, it's in first-order language. For Ryle, in other ordinary language expressions. The discontinuity comes only with complaints against philosophers being bewitched by language, an obvious late Wittgensteinian theme. So the question is there anything more than the complaints against philosophers in the project? So what's new here other than the complaints against philosophers and the late Wittgensteinian theme? The answer seems to be not a whole lot. The final piece of ordinary language philosophy that I asked you to read is Austin's A Plea for Excuses. I'll begin by offering an excuse for asking you to read such a horribly written paper. This is, to my mind, the worst published piece of philosophy in terms of its structure that's ever appeared. That's probably an exaggeration, but this is a terribly constructed paper. It's meandering, wandering. What's the thesis of the paper? It's very hard to state what a thesis is, and there's nothing worse than a philosophy paper without a thesis. He tells you what his subject matter is and says, look, there's lots of things that are worth thinking about in this area. The subject matter has to do with responsibility, blame, excuses, justifications, and all sorts of things. So central to what Austin is doing is trying to do what we find in the law, where we have a category of justification and a category of excusability. So you can have laws where the first step is to decide whether what you did was justified in terms of what the law says, and if it violates the law, then it wasn't justified. But after determining whether or not your behavior was justified, there's a question of whether there's an excusability dimension that needs to be taken into account. So, suppose you drop a tea tray to prevent an emotional storm. That's one sort of quite intentional behavior. But you might also have dropped the tea tray because you were frightened of the wasp, and that's not an intentional dropping of the tree. You might have killed someone in the most intentional way possible in a battle. Suppose you're a sniper and your job is to take out as many of the enemy as you can. That's obviously intentional killing. But you can also kill someone out of recklessness. So you suppose that the law prohibits killing, and then you ask, what are the excusability conditions attached to the law, given that you actually did kill someone? Well, that's mens rea requirements. Mens rea requirements for killing have to do with, do you satisfy the mens rea? Do you have a guilty mind? That's, I think, an intentionality requirement. Did you do this on purpose? There's also weaker standards. You might not have done it on purpose, but you were reckless or you were negligent. Those are two different standards. The differences between them are interesting, but unimportant for understanding Austin's paper. The point is, we have, in the general area of accepting and ascribing responsibility, we have two categories that are said to be important by Austin: the excusable and the justifiable. There are complications here as well. Sometimes you have a full excuse, in which case you don't hold the person responsible at all, but not always. So let's call defeaters the ones that alleviate you from any charge of irresponsibility whatsoever. but there can be diminishers that do not alleviate you of all responsibility. Here's the Austin quote. It's arguable that we do not use the terms justification and excuse. Notice, by the way, the failure of use mentions sensitivity here again. If you're talking about the terms, you need to be mentioning them as carefully as we might. A miscellany of even less clear terms, such as extenuation, palliation, mitigation, hovers uneasily between partial justification and partial excuse. And when we plead, say, provocation, there's a genuine uncertainty or ambiguity as to what we mean. Is he partly responsible, part because he roused a violent impulse or passion in me, so that it wasn't truly or merely me acting of my own accord, excuse, or is it rather that he having done me such injury I was entitled to retaliate? That's a justification rather than an excuse. So there are complications here. Why should we study excuses? Lots of reasons. They're relevant to the nature of action, they're central to the problem of freedom and the related concept of responsibility, and they're a good test case for the method of linguistic phenomenology. Now, this is the one that lies behind why I asked you to read this, because you're in the process of thinking about philosophical questions, and these people want you to attend to ordinary language, and the question you should ask is, why should I be doing that? We need a defense of the methodology that's being proposed, the method of linguistic phenomenology, where we take very seriously what ordinary language says or involves about these sorts of things. So, what is the nature of this method and what is its justification? That, I think, is the centrally important part of this paper. The rest is a meandering mess, but this is one of the only places we get an explanation and defense of this method. So, some quotes. If we are to proceed from ordinary language, that is by examining what we should say, when, and so why, and what we should mean by it, perhaps this method, at least as one philosophical method, scarcely requires justification at present. Too evidently, there is gold in them thar hills. Think of an Oxford Don trying to sound like he's from Arkansas. Apparently, that's what he's doing. More opportune would be the warning about the care and thoroughness needed if it is not to fall into disrepute. So, what's the method? The ordinary language method is we start by examining what we should say, when, and so why, and what we should mean by it. So we look at how we talk and derive something about meaning as a result of this investigation of what we should say when. And why should we engage in such a method? Well, it hardly requires justification because it's evident to us that there's stuff to be learned here. The only question is, do we need a warning about how to do it well? And obviously, with any method, such a warning would be appropriate. So, what is the central defense? The central defense is this. Thirdly, and more hopefully, our common stock of words embodies all the distinctions excuse the sexist terminology, embodies all the distinctions people have found worth drawing, and the connections they have found worth making in the lifetimes of many generations. These surely are likely to be more numerous, more sound, since they have stood up to the long test of the survival of the fittest, and more subtle, at least in all ordinary and reasonably practical matters, than any that you or I are likely to think up in our armchairs of an afternoon, the most favored alternative method. This is worth thinking about carefully, trying to figure out exactly how this argument is supposed to go. The first part is a likelihood claim. The wisdom of the people has a much more impressive history than what a bunch of philosophers sitting in their offices at Oxford on a Friday afternoon in 1950 would have. So there's something here about the value of ideas that have stood the test of time. Whether that's rightly characterized in terms of likelihood of truth, I don't know. But in any case, there's something substantial here about the distinctions people have found worth drawing, and the connections they have found worth marking. That there's something to be recognized here that would be good. The problem is this remark gets undermined when we notice the proviso. Why are they so good? Well, they've stood up to the long test of the survival of the fittest, at least in ordinary and reasonably practical matters. That should raise a red flag for you. How much of philosophy is actually about ordinary and reasonably practical matters? Some of it is. It's called ethics. Well, at least some of ethics is about ordinary and reasonably practical matters. A lot of ethics is meta-ethics, which is just, as I understand that term, as I use that term, it's about the metaphysical implications of ethical language, thought, talk, and judgment. So what does the world have to be like for it to be the case that murder is wrong and whatever, lying is a bad idea? All those sorts of ethical judgments, what is required in our understanding of the nature of reality for those things to be accurate, for the judgments to be accurate or correct or true? Moreover, as soon as we see him discuss some of the limitations of the view, we'll see that the proviso is crucial. So, for example, time isn't a good candidate here. If you're going to think about the philosophy of time, paying attention to ordinary language isn't going to really get you very far. So the central defense is crucial. Are there distinctions and connections found in the ordinary wisdom of the ages? Start out thinking about those. Take them into account in what you're working on. It would be hard to find any philosopher in the 20th century who didn't think this was worth taking into account in some way or other. But remember, ordinary language philosophy is not just that we should start there, but that we derive our conclusions from that input. That's what the method is. It is both a method that tells you where to start, but also tells you what your appropriate evidential base has to be limited to. And what it has to be limited to is the information you glean from what we should say and when. Okay, so some limitations. Time isn't a good candidate. The other thing is, this is interesting. You really want ordinary language judgments that are not infected by philosophical thought and ideas. Now, you might question whether there are any such pieces of ordinary language and how in the world you would separate the two out. Those are really good questions. Notice that this is, in the late Wittgensteinian tradition, there's some anti-philosophy, anti-theory elements. Wittgenstein, remember at the beginning of the investigations, admits to succumbing to a kind of philosophical disease. He can't get away from the questions of philosophy. He needs to be freed of them. And engaging in philosophical thought and reflection for him was a kind of therapy that would finally let him get away from these questions and quit asking them. And part of just merely describing the grammar of a form of life is that it's no longer infected by the disease that philosophy is. It's hard to be a philosophy professor if you're a late Wittgensteinian. So you go teach intro And what you do is you infect people with a disease by introducing them to the subject matter. And then I guess perhaps you hope to cure them by the end of the semester. I don't know how that's supposed to work, but maybe if you get them to be convinced. Describers of the grammars of forms of life, you have done it. Maybe that worked for Wittgenstein, I don't know. But in any case, you get this rejection of philosophy that if you're talking about a topic that's tainted by philosophy, then that's not a good candidate for doing ordinary language philosophy on. To my mind, that sort of gives away the farm, because I don't know anything that philosophers are going to think about or talk about where ordinary language hasn't been infected by philosophical thought, hasn't been tainted by it in some way. What are the dangers of this method? He says there are two. The first snag is the snag of loose or divergent or alternative usage. The second, the crux of the last word. So, what are these snags? We now have names for them. It would be nice to have a little description. A disagreement as to what we should say is not to be shied off, but to be pounced upon. For the explanation of it can hardly fail to be illuminating. If we light on an electron that rotates the wrong way, that's a discovery, a portent to be followed up, not a reason for chucking physics. And by the same token, a genuinely loose or eccentric talker is a rare specimen to be prized. What in the world is he thinking? Well, think about language which is important. Think about people who find bias everywhere in everything anybody ever says. Or think about people who see coercion in places that you don't see it. So if I give you a homework assignment and your grade depends on whether or not you do the homework assignment, are you being coerced by me? I would say no, but there's some people that see coercion everywhere. These loose, eccentric talkers are to be prized. The reason for pointing this out is because maybe you think people who find coercion or bias everywhere are misusing the term. And if you have a theory of meaning on which the central way of figuring out what the meaning of a term is its use, then eccentric talkers are out of bounds. They are misusing the terms. So Austin is right. There's an important thing here. When do you decide when a term is being misused, or when it is being used properly with someone having an eccentric view of things? That's an important thing to pay attention to. Don't discount eccentric speakers or thinkers. Second, if a distinction works well enough for practical purposes in ordinary life, then there is sure to be something in it. It will not mark nothing. That might be overstated, but it's at least some evidence that there's something in it. It doesn't mark nothing. Yet this is likely enough to be not the best way of arranging things if our interests are more extensive or intellectual than the ordinary. And again, that experience has been derived only from the sources available to ordinary men throughout most of civilized history. It has not been fed from the resources of the microscope and its successors. And it must be added to that superstition and error and fantasy of all kinds do become incorporated in ordinary language, and even sometimes stand up to the survival test. Certainly, then, ordinary language is not the last word. In principle, it can everywhere be supplemented and improved upon and superseded. Only remember, it is the first word. That's Austin's defense of ordinary language philosophy. It's where you start, it may not be where you end up. The footnote, by the way, is an interesting one. Right after saying that, only remember it is the first word, he says something remarkable. and forget for once and for a while that other curious question, is it true? May we? Why would he say that? Well, he's telling you to start with the wisdom of the ages, encoded in ordinary language. And everybody is going to want to say, why should we start there? Shouldn't we focus on whether the wisdom of the ages encoded in ordinary language, whether it's true? And so he puts in the footnote and says, can we just not ask that? Now, it would be fun to talk to him about what he's thinking. Of course, we can quit asking it. We can also quit doing philosophy and go dig ditches. Is that what we should be doing? Sometimes late Wittgenstein sounds like that. You just got to go do something else, which is what he did. Go teach second graders how to do math. And whatever you do, don't smack any of them because they can't add very well. You can get in trouble that way, as Wittgenstein learned. Okay, so what are the sources for this method? The sources. Go to the dictionary. Here's an interesting anecdote. When I was a grad student in a philosophy of science class, the professor, I won't name him, came in and said, this wasn't at Notre Dame, by the way, so don't start looking at villains in the Notre Dame philosophy department. He came in and asked, what's the most important book in the history of philosophy? Now, this philosopher was a fan of late Wittgenstein in many respects. So what's the most important book? And we all looked at each other like, what a stupid question that is. What are you going to do? Say the Republic? So somebody said the Republic, and he said no. Somebody said Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. He said no. Do you know what the right answer is? The right answer is the dictionary. That's the most important book in all of philosophy. So the dictionary. Sources for the method also include the law and psychology. Now, once you go past the dictionary and start looking at other sources, you should wonder why those? I mean, if we're going to look at psychology, can we pay attention to sociology and anthropology? And if we're going to look at some of the social sciences, can we look at, say, the natural sciences, physics, chemistry, biology? After all, philosophy is about having the most general understanding of all reality. So why can't we take advantage of the special sciences, the sciences that are somehow devoted to parts of reality if our efforts are aimed at all of reality? So anyway, those are the sources. Then the rest of the paper I'm just not going to talk about. You can learn a lot from it, but it's just beyond the cackle is Austin's phrase, but it's a great illustration of the most ludicrous way to write a paper. This is not well constructed in any sense at all, but it does have interesting ideas in it. So let's focus. Are there things that theses at stake that most philosophers would probably endorse? Yes, Austin has some targets that he's thinking he might be able to undermine, that a lot of philosophers want to endorse or partially embrace or something. Start investigating action by asking what turns an event into an action. Philosophers do typically think that way. In fact, action theory begins with Wittgenstein's question in the investigations. What's the difference between my arm going up and my raising my arm? A first answer is, well, your arm going up is an event. You raising your arm is an action. So what is the difference? An attractive start is, well, an action has an intentional component to it. My arm can go up even though I didn't intend or try to make it go up. But if I raise my arm, I intended or tried. All right, Austin doesn't want to start that way. He wants to sneak up on the question by asking what sorts of excuses, justifications, extenuating circumstances, and explanations we offer for our actions. Is that going to be a more productive route to follow if your goal is to try to understand what an action is? Maybe, maybe not. A second predilection among philosophers. Actions are things that are either voluntary or involuntary. Austin says it's much more complicated. The whole question of negations and opposites is germane, since the opposite of the first, being voluntary, is under constraint or duress, or obligation, where the opposite of the second is deliberately or on purpose. Now, this notion of opposite, I'm not quite sure what it is just start with the word all. What's the opposite of all? None? It's not the contradictory of all. It's the contrary of all. So one of the things to worry about is when people start relying on words like the opposite of. Are they thinking about contrary relations? Which logical relation do they really have in mind? They have in mind, Austin here seems to have in mind what the ordinary man in the street will express as something incompatible with voluntary. So what is it for something, if it's not voluntary, what is it? Obligatory? Under constraint? Done under constraint? What's the opposite of involuntary? Deliberately? That's what he's thinking. I think, though, there's a lot of mess covered over by using this phrase. And so we have to be more careful not to follow Austin there. If you're going to talk about the opposite of something, it sounds to me like you ought to be talking about what's contradictory with respect to it. In any case, Austin challenges people who think there's not much difference between doing something intentionally, deliberately, or on purpose. That's the mistake of the judges and the lawyers in the legal case that he looks at. And looking at the details of that case is kind of interesting. Only the defendant is the one who's being really careful. Something can be done intentionally, perhaps, but not on purpose. Those are things worth paying attention to. So there's lots of interesting stuff in this paper. So one way to think about the paper is it gets the status it has not because it was well written, but because it's got really some interesting, provocative ideas in it that many people thought were worth investigating further on their own. But one of the features of ordinary language philosophy is the absolutely horrendous structure of the papers that were written. A professor of mine at Notre Dame said, when you read 1960s Oxford Ordinary Language Philosophy, none of it makes any sense until you realize it's just a compendium of conversations that a philosopher had with his colleagues. So he went down the hall and talked to X, and X said this. So that's the first paragraph of the paper. And then he went to another colleague, talked to somebody else, and they said Y. And so he talks about Y in the paper. And it's just a sequential account of various interesting things people had to say about the topic that the author was writing about, and then you publish it. That's a terrible way to write a philosophy paper. Philosophy papers ought to be thesis defense papers, not history of philosophy papers, although I think they should have a thesis too. But each paper has a topic. A paper needs to have a thesis, and then it's supposed to defend that thesis. That's called a thesis defense paper. And the structure of the paper ought to be clear to the reader, and it ought to be clear why you're talking about whatever you're talking about when you're talking about it. Other than that, it's just a poorly structured paper. And a plea for excuses is the poster child for a poorly constructed philosophy paper. In any case, that's all about Austin's paper, and it's all we're going to do on ordinary language philosophy. It shone brightly for a short amount of time, and then came to be seen as something that really wasn't going to take us anywhere, that the hard work of philosophy could not be replaced by just listening carefully to how ordinary people talk. That's not going to solve or address any of the deepest philosophical questions that we have. So enough of ordinary language philosophy. We've now characterized logical positivism and logical empiricism, and now we're going to move into the 1950s for the beginning of the collapse of this view. So we'll turn to Carnap first, and then to the critics of the logical empiricist tradition in Chisholm, Sellers, and Quine.